Freud analyzed infantile sexuality from 7 aspects. First, the period of sexual latency in childhood and its interruptions. Second, the manifestation of infantile sexuality. Third, the sexual aim of infantile sexuality. Fourth, masturbatory sexual manifestation. 5. The sexual researches of childhood. 6. The phases of development of the sexual organization. And lastly, the sources of infantile sexuality. The period of sexual latency of childhood and its interruptions. Freud uses imagery of a water dam to explain interruptions that are being encountered in the phase of sexual latency. The foundation of the water dam is actually heredity. Heredity plays an important role in suppression of sexual instincts and lays a foundation for effects of education. For education, concepts like shame, disgust, and morality are being taught in this phase, which create suppressing forces, although heredity remains the most essential element. Second, physical restrictions of the genitalia. Because one's genitalia doesn't gain full sexual function through puberty, it naturally restricts the sexuality in infancy. When the energy is being suppressed, it diverts itself onto other subjects. However, an inevitable erotic pleasure conflicts with the latency, which is the phases of development, and therefore further create opposing mental forces such as shame and disgust. Third, the sexual aim of infantile sexuality. The aim of infantile sexuality is to obtain satisfaction by stimulus of selected erotogenic zones. Erotogenic zones is any part of skin or membrane in a body that can sense a sensation. This satisfaction, in order to form a need for its repetition, must have been previously experienced, as Freud explained. The state of being in need of a repetition of the satisfaction reveals itself in 2 ways. First, the feeling of attention, indeed similar to the character of unpleasure. Second, a sensation of itching or stimulation which is centrally conditioned and being sensed in peripheral erotogenic zones. Then, the external stimulus replaces the projected sensations, such as itch, the feeling of tension, with a sense of satisfaction, and that form the need for its repetition. Fourth, masturbatory sexual manifestation. Anal zone. As Freud explained, this zone is of erotogenic significance and is very great from the first. It is actually the first zone that gives pleasure and lets the infant experience what is pleasure. Freud describes feces as the first gift to infantile sexuality. Like, for example, the production of feces indicates active compliance with the environment. On the other hand, retention, like holding back the feces, builds accumulation which yields greater pleasure on release and indicated disobedience. As Freud put, children who are making use of susceptibility to erotogenic stimulation of the anal zone betray themselves by holding back their stool till its accumulation brings about violent muscular contractions, and, as it passes through the anus, it's able to produce powerful stimulation of the mucous membrane. In so doing, it must no doubt cause not only painful, but also highly pleasurable sensations. Genital zones. Surprisingly, it is not the first erotogenic zone, yet Freud explained it is destined to great things in the future. It lays the foundation of infantile masturbation. As I previously mentioned in part 3, there has to be a need of repetition in order to form pleasure. And the need of repetition for genital zones is generated from the anatomical situation of this region, the secretions in which it is bathed, the washing and rubbing to which it is subjected in the course of a child's toilet, as well as accidental stimulation, such as the movement of intestinal worms in the case of girls. In this passage, Freud also mentioned different techniques of obtaining pleasure in genital zones by gender. For girls, it will be a rubbing movement. For boys, the preference of hand indeed indicate an instinct of mastery like a masculine sexual instinct. Second phase of infantile masturbation and return to early infantile masturbation. Second phase of infantile masturbation happens at the age of 4, where the genital zone revives and persists again. This stage leaves the deepest impressions to the subconscious mind, and it determines whether an individual will stay healthy or experience neurotic symptoms after puberty. Also, return to early infantile masturbation appears in 2 different forms. First, tickling stimulus, which seeks satisfaction in masturbation. Second, nocturnal emission, which is an involuntary ejaculation of semen during sleep, which occurs in boys. Polymorphously perverse disposition and component instinct. Seductions in infantile stage can lead to sexual irregularities, such as polymorphously perverse, which is the ability to gain sexual gratification outside socially normative sexual behaviors, such as scopophilia, exhibitionism, and cruelty. And this is considered component instincts. Some components of infantile sexuality involve the help of other people from the start. Firstly, scopophilia. Small children whose attention has once been drawn, as a rule by masturbation, to their own genitals, usually take the first step without help from outside and develop a lively interest in the genitals of their playmates. Second, exhibitionism. Small children are essentially without shame, and in some periods of their earliest year show an unmistakable sophistication in exposing their bodies, with a special emphasis on the sexual parts. Cruelty. This sexual irregularities manifest because of the capacity of the PD is developed late and therefore facilitate the development of it in early childhood. Children who distinguish themselves by special cruelty towards animal and playmates usually give rise to a just suspicion of an intense and precocious sexual activity arising from erotogenic zones.
So next we're going to talk about the sexual researches of children. Every child by nature will embark on a search for sexual knowledge between the ages of 3 and 5. This comes in the form of the fabled question, where do babies come from? It shows the child's curiosity in their own sexuality and bodily functions. Children who kind of get too much knowledge on this search and witness a sexual act will inevitably view it as something violent, which will lead to a sadistic sexual nature and harm emotional development. And also, I want to point out the importance of a failure of sexual research. It kind of marks as a moment of alienation for children, but also it's good for developing their independence in the world. In part 6 of the document, Freud kind of goes over the different phases of sexual development in children. So pregenital organizations is the phase where there's no separation of the sex drive and the act of consuming food, defecation, and nourishment in general. All oral pleasures, we went over that. Ambivalence is often viewed as the chaotic and sadistic phase of infantile sexuality. There is a focus on anal play. And finally, diphasic choice of objects, hence the di. This phase is characterized by its 2 waves. The first wave encompasses the infantile sexual aim of children, while the second, following the repression of infantile sexuality, occurs during puberty. We kind of went over the infantile amnesia, which comes with that. Within these 2 waves, there is a change in sexual aim and a new understanding of sexuality. Next, we're going to talk about certain sources of infantile sexuality. Mechanical excitations is the stimuli from rhythmic mechanical motion. Muscular activity is sexual stimuli from the exertion of muscles and skin-to-skin contact. Freud uses the example of children wrestling with their playmates and roughhousing and such. Affective processes is infantile sexuality initiated by high tension or stress. Then there's stimuli from intellectual work. It's the concentration of a task that can be exciting. This is the cognitive element of sexuality. And there's varieties of sexual constitution, which is stimuli existing outside of the erotogenic zones. And then pathways of mutual influence. Freud said this was still being studied at the time, and he has a lot of questions. But it's the connecting pathways of influence between sexuality and health relating to the psyche and the body. Alright, so thank you for listening. I'll make sure to put a link to the Google Slides as well if you want to look back at the presentation.